The morning Margaret Monroe's wagon wheel cracked clean through on the rutted Kansas trail. She did not cry, though she had plenty of reason to. She had been driving alone for 11 days by then, which was itself a kind of miracle, or perhaps a kind of stubbornness, depending on who you asked. The year was 1874, and the land between Independence, Missouri, and the Colorado Territory stretched out like a dare thrown down by God himself, flat and brown and enormous, cut through by shallow rivers, and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees that looked too fragile to have survived anything at all. Margaret Monroe was 31 years old, and she had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned under a wide-brimmed bonnet, and gray eyes that people sometimes described as stormy and other times described as kind, depending on what she was looking at when they saw them. She was not particularly tall, but there was something in the way she carried herself straight-backed in the wagon seat, reins held loosely but surely in her calloused hands, that made her seem larger than she was. She had left Independence with $40 in silver coins sewn into the hem of her traveling skirt, a single trunk of possessions, enough dried beef and hardtack and cornmeal to last 6 weeks if she was careful, 2 water barrels, and a mule named Theodore who was old and opinionated, and had, on their 3rd day out, simply refused to move until Margaret had spoken to him quietly for 20 minutes about the general nature of their situation. After that, Theodore had gotten on with it, and they had reached a kind of understanding. Her husband, Robert Monroe, had gone west 2 years before her. He had written her 4 letters from Colorado, each one more enthusiastic than the last, describing land he had filed a claim on near the town of Caldwell Creek, a house he was building, a garden plot he had cleared. The 5th letter never came. Instead, a man named Harvey Deeks, who ran the general store in Independence, had handed her a telegram one gray October morning that said Robert Monroe had been killed when a mine shaft collapsed near his claim. It was 11 words long, that telegram. 11 words to end 11 years of marriage. Margaret had spent the winter grieving. She had spent the spring deciding. By May of 1874, she had made up her mind that she was going anyway. The land was hers by law, Robert's claim transferred to her name after considerable argument with the land office clerk, who could not quite believe a widow meant to work a homestead alone. She had stared at him until he stamped the papers. The land was hers. She was going. So she drove west alone, and she managed it, and on the 11th day the wheel cracked. She heard the sound before she felt it, a sharp report like a rifle shot, and then the wagon lurched badly to the right, and Theodore, who had more sense than most people, stopped immediately without being told. Margaret set the brake and climbed down and looked at the rear wheel and felt the particular heaviness of a problem that cannot be wished away. The iron tire had worked loose at some point in the last mile, and the wooden felloe beneath it had cracked under the stress, splitting along the grain so that the whole wheel listed sideways like a drunk man leaning on a fence post. She stood in the road and looked at it for a moment. The sky was enormous and pale blue, and not a single cloud interrupted it. The wind moved through the grass on either side of the trail with a low, constant sound like breathing. Ahead of her, the trail curved around a low rise and disappeared. Behind her, there was nothing but the same flat expanse she had been crossing for 11 days. She knew how to fix a wheel. Robert had taught her back in Missouri, saying it was the kind of thing a person ought to know regardless of their circumstances. She had the tools, a hammer, a wedge, spare spokes, a length of iron strap, and enough faith in her own hands that she believed she could manage it given enough time and effort. The trouble was the iron tire. She could wedge and brace the wood, but without someone to hold the tire while she hammered it back onto the rim, the work would be very slow and very uncertain. She was working at it, crouched beside the wheel in the dust, hammer in hand, her bonnet pushed back off her forehead, when she heard hooves. She did not look up immediately. There were enough people on the trail that hooves were not remarkable. The hooves slowed, then stopped. She looked up. The man sitting on the dark bay horse was perhaps 35, with a lean, weathered face and dark eyes set under a straight brow. He wore a plain canvas shirt, sun-faded to almost no color at all, and dark trousers tucked into worn boots. His hat was a practical thing, wide-brimmed and honest. He had a rifle in the saddle scabbard and a revolver on his hip, which was common enough for a man traveling alone in 1874, and something in the way he held himself on the horse, easy and balanced, with his hands loose on the reins, said he had been riding since before he could properly remember doing anything else. He looked at the wheel. He looked at her. "You want a hand with that tire," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. It did not presume. "I would be grateful," Margaret said, which was true. He dismounted and tied his horse to the wagon's tail gate, and without any further conversation, he took up a position on the opposite side of the wheel from her, and they worked together in the heat for the better part of 2 hours. He held the iron tire steady while she hammered the wedge into place, and he had strong hands that did not slip or tire, and he offered suggestions only when they were useful and kept quiet the rest of the time, which Margaret appreciated enormously. By the time they had the wheel sound enough to travel on, the sun had moved considerably across the sky, and the shadow of the wagon had swung around to point almost due east. She offered him water from her barrel, and he accepted it with a nod and drank and handed the ladle back. "I am Margaret Monroe," she said. "Alfred Watkins," he said. They looked at each other for a moment in the direct, uncomplicated way of people who have just done physical work together and are still slightly out of breath from it. "Which way are you heading?" she asked. "West," he said. "So am I," she said. He looked at the wheel again and then at Theodore, who regarded him from under heavy eyelids with the profound skepticism of a very old mule. "That wheel will hold for now," Alfred said, "but it wants watching." "I know it," Margaret said. She climbed back up to the wagon seat. She gathered the reins. She clucked to Theodore, who moved forward with his characteristic slow dignity. Alfred Watkins mounted his bay horse and rode out alongside her, maybe 6 feet off her left front wheel, not close enough to crowd her, not so far that he had obviously made a choice about his distance. He just rode. The trail stretched ahead of them and they moved through it together, and neither of them said anything for a long while, and the silence was not uncomfortable. That was the first day. She did not ask him why he rode beside her wagon. He did not offer an explanation. When the light began to fail and the temperature dropped with the sudden authority it always did on the Kansas plain, Margaret guided Theodore off the trail to a flat piece of ground near a shallow creek, and she climbed down and began the practiced work of making camp, unhitching Theodore and hobbling him so he could graze, pulling her small cook pot and her bag of cornmeal from the wagon, collecting enough dead wood from the creek bank to make a fire. Alfred Watkins pulled his horse up a short distance away and unsaddled and hobbled the bay, and then without being asked, he began collecting wood as well, and they built the fire together, and she cooked cornmeal mush and fried a piece of salt pork and divided it, and they ate on opposite sides of the fire like 2 people who had some kind of history of eating meals together, which they did not, and yet the easiness of it did not seem to require explanation. "You have people in Colorado?" She asked because it was a reasonable thing to ask. "No," he said. She waited, but he did not add to this. "I have land," she said, "near Caldwell Creek. My husband filed the claim. He passed last year." Alfred looked at the fire. "I am sorry," he said, and the way he said it simply, without the performance of sympathy that she had grown exhausted by over the past many months, made her believe that he meant it. "Thank you," she said. The coyote started up somewhere to the north, that particular sound like questions being asked and never answered. An owl passed over them, a dark shape against the enormous dark sky, and she watched it until it disappeared. "Do you know the country between here and Caldwell Creek?" she asked. "Some of it," he said. "There is a river crossing at a place called Bent Fork," she said. "The man at the last way station said it was running high." Alfred nodded slowly. "It is," he said. "I crossed it 4 days back going east. It is manageable, but you want to pick your spot carefully and not rush it." She looked at him. "You came from Colorado?" "From near there," he said. She did not ask more. The fire popped. Theodore tore at the grass with the even rhythmic sound of a large animal entirely at peace with its situation. She said goodnight and climbed into the wagon and lay down on her blankets and listened to the prairie making its nighttime sounds for a while before she slept. When she woke in the gray pre-dawn, Alfred Watkins was already up, his fire rekindled, his horse saddled. He had put fresh water in her drinking bucket from the creek without being asked. She looked at the full bucket for a moment and felt something move in her chest that she could not immediately name. They were on the trail before full sunrise. He rode beside her wagon, a steady, quiet presence on her left, and she drove and thought about what it meant that she was not bothered by him being there. She had expected to be. She was not a woman who was accustomed to needing company, and she was particularly not accustomed to wanting company without being able to articulate why. Alfred Watkins did not talk much, but what he did say was worth listening to. He pointed out where the trail dipped into boggy ground ahead, saving her the trouble of getting the wheel mired. He noticed when one of Theodore's traces had worked loose and mentioned it before it caused a problem. When they stopped to rest at midday in the shade of a creek's cottonwood fringe, he produced a small tin of coffee from his saddlebag and offered to share it, and the coffee was excellent, dark and strong, and they sat on a fallen log and drank it without speaking much, and it was one of the more pleasant midday rests she had had on the entire journey. "Did you fight?" she asked him after a while. She had noticed the way he carried himself and the particular kind of awareness he had, always knowing where the horizon was, always angled so he could see the trail behind them. She had known men who fought in the war between the states, and some of them had come back carrying that awareness like a second skin. He looked at her with his dark eyes. "Yes," he said. "Which side?" she asked, because it still mattered in 1874 and she was direct enough to ask. "The Union," he said. She nodded. She had lost a brother to the war, fighting for the same side, and she had no patience for dancing around such things. "My brother Thomas died at Chickamauga," she said. "He was 20 years old." Alfred turned his coffee cup in his hands. "A bad engagement," he said quietly. "I was not there, I was in Virginia." They were quiet again. The cottonwood leaves trembled above them in the slight breeze, making their soft, dry clatter. "Are you always this easy to be around?" she asked, somewhat to her own surprise. He looked at her and she thought she saw the corner of his mouth move very slightly. "I have been told I am not talkative enough," he said. "That is not what I said," she pointed out. "No," he agreed, "it is not." They packed up and went on, and the afternoon unrolled ahead of them in the particular amber light that the Kansas sky produced in late May. And she drove and he rode and the wagon wheel held. And by the time they made camp that second evening, they had developed a routine that felt, oddly, like something they had always done. That second night she found herself listening for particular sounds, the specific sound of his boots on the ground when he walked, the low sound he made to settle his horse, the sound of him banking the fire before he bedded down. She found all of them, one by one, and only after she had found them all did she fall asleep. In the morning she woke to the smell of coffee again. She sat up and pushed her hair back and looked through the canvas, puckering at the back of the wagon at the world outside, which was all gray and gold, and beginning to blush pink in the east. She could see the fire and Alfred Watkins crouched beside it, pouring coffee into 2 cups with the careful economy of a man who had spent a great deal of his life outdoors. She climbed down and accepted the cup, and they stood together watching the sun come up over the flat horizon, and the light came in long columns across the grass, and the world was so beautiful it almost hurt, and she thought about the fact that she had been alone on this trail for 11 days before the wheel broke, and that the aloneness had not bothered her. She was a self-sufficient woman and proud of it. But that this, whatever this was, this quiet companionship, was something she had not known she was missing. "The Bent Fork crossing will be today," Alfred said. "Will we manage it?" "We will," he said. I will ride across first and check the bottom. You follow where I go." He looked at him over her coffee cup. He was looking at the horizon, not at her, and there was something in his profile, the straight line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, that she found she had been looking at more often than was strictly necessary. "Mr. Watkins," she said. "Alfred," he said. "Alfred," she said. "Why are you riding beside my wagon?" He turned to look at her then, and for a moment she thought he was going to say something that answered the question. His dark eyes were steady and serious. "Because I am going in the same direction," he said. It was not the whole truth, and they both knew it, but she accepted it, because she understood that some things had to arrive in their own time, and because she found, somewhat to her own amusement, that she was not in any great hurry to understand it before it was ready to be understood. "Fair enough," she said. She never asked him again. The Bent Fork River crossing was everything the way station man had warned it would be. The river ran brown and fast, swollen from rains upstream, and the bank on the near side was churned to mud by the hooves of cattle and mules that had crossed in recent days. Alfred rode into the water and crossed it at an angle, reading the current, checking the bottom with his horse's motion, and he came out on the far side and turned and looked back at her with an expression that was not quite a reassurance and not quite a command, but was somewhere between the two and entirely persuasive. Margaret squared herself on the wagon seat. She clicked to Theodore. The old mule walked into the water with enormous dignity and no enthusiasm. The current hit the wagon broadside when they got to the deepest part, maybe 3 feet of rushing brown water, and the wagon shifted and swayed, and she felt the repaired wheel, catch on something on the bottom, and for a single terrible second she thought they were going sideways. She held the reins steady and kept Theodore moving forward, because stopping in current like this was worse than going wrong, and Alfred was already in the water again, his horse plunging toward her, his hand out toward Theodore's bridle. He did not need to take hold of the bridle. Theodore found his footing and lunged forward, and they came up the far bank in a spray of muddy water, and Margaret held the reins and exhaled very slowly. Alfred pulled up beside her. His horse was blowing hard. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. "That was well done," he said. "Theodore did most of it," she said. "Theodore and you," he said. She looked at him, and this time the corner of his mouth did more than move. He smiled at her, a real smile, slow and genuine, and she felt it in her chest like a warm hand pressed flat against her ribs. They stopped on the far bank to let the animals rest and to check the wagon. The repaired wheel had survived, but it was weeping slightly at the crack, which meant the wedge had shifted, and Alfred and Margaret spent an hour in the mud of the riverbank re-wedging it and rewrapping it with the spare iron strap and hammering everything tight again. They were both thoroughly muddy by the end of it, and she was fairly certain she had mud in her ear, and Alfred had a streak of it across his cheek that he had not noticed. And when she mentioned it, he looked so genuinely surprised that she laughed, a real laugh, the first one she had produced in a long while. He laughed too, quietly, and it changed his whole face, and she thought she understood something about him in that moment that all his quiet competence had not told her. That he was a man who had been serious for a very long time, maybe longer than was strictly good for a person, and that the laugh surprised him almost as much as it surprised her. They drove on through the afternoon. The land began to change. The utter flatness of eastern Kansas gave way to low, rolling hills, and the grass was different here, greener, with more variety to it, and she could see, very distantly in the west, what might have been the suggestion of mountains, though it was impossible to be certain. "Is that them?" she asked, pointing. Alfred looked west and squinted slightly. "The edge of them," he said. "You will not see them properly for 2 more days. 2 more days." She was aware that she had been thinking of them simply as 2 people traveling together, and that at some point in the last days she had stopped expecting him to peel off onto his own trail, and that this too was something she had not interrogated very carefully. "Where exactly are you going?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, which she was accustomed to by now. He was a man who paused before speaking, not from evasion but from the habit of meaning what he said. "I am not certain," he said. She looked at him. "You said you came from near Caldwell Creek." "That is right," he said. "And you are going west." "That is right. To Caldwell Creek." Another pause. "Perhaps," he said. She thought about this for a while. The wagon moved. Theodore's ears swiveled independently of each other in the contemplative way they always did when he was walking without incident. "I see," she said, though she did not entirely see yet, and she suspected that was all right. That third evening, they camped on a hillside with a long view west, and the sunset was spectacular, purple and orange, and a thin line of green right at the horizon that she had never seen before and could not explain. She sat on the wagon's back step and Alfred sat on his upturned saddle a few feet away, and they watched it happen the way you watch something you know is going away, with the specific attention you give to things you want to remember. "It is beautiful country," she said. "It is," he said. "My husband described it in his letters," she said. "He wrote about the sky mostly. He always said I would not believe the sky until I saw it." "He was right," Alfred said. "He was a good man," she said. "Not a perfect man, but a good one. He worked hard and he was kind and he did not drink more than was reasonable. I miss him." "That is a fine thing to be able to say about a person," Alfred said. "Did him? What about you? Have you been married?" The pause this time was longer. "Briefly," he said. "She died, a fever, in '68. We had been married 8 months. "I am sorry," she said, the way he had said it to her, simply and without performance. "It was a long time ago," he said, but the way he said it told her that a long time was not the same as healed. She looked back at the sunset. The green line at the horizon was gone now and the purple was deepening. "What was her name?" Margaret asked. "Clara," he said. "She was lucky to have been loved that way," Margaret said. 6 years later and you still carry her carefully." He looked at her then with something in his expression that was not quite surprise and not quite gratitude and was in the territory of both. "You are a remarkably perceptive woman," he said. "I had a long winter to become one," she said. They were quiet again. A nighthawk made its buzzing call overhead and the first stars appeared and the fire burned down to orange coals. "Alfred," she said. "Margaret," he said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. "Why are you really riding beside my wagon?" she asked. She said it quietly and without any edge to it. She was not demanding an answer. She was simply offering him the space to give one if he wanted to. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked into the coals, and she waited because she was good at waiting. "I was in Caldwell Creek 6 weeks ago," he said finally. "There was a man there, a land agent, who told me about a woman coming west alone from Independence, a widow, coming to work a homestead claim." He paused. He made a remark about it, about her not being likely to manage it alone. Disparaging sort of remark the kind men make about women in situations that inconvenience their assumptions. He looked up at her. "It bothered me considerable. I do not know why. I had never met you." "Go on," she said. "I was in Independence on business, and I was at the stage office, and I saw you loading your wagon. You were arguing with a man from the freight company about the weight of your trunk. You won the argument." He paused again. "You had the sort of manner about you, the way you stood, the way you spoke, that made me think the land agent in Caldwell Creek was going to be very surprised." Margaret was watching him carefully in the firelight. "And then when your wheel broke," he said, "and I saw you already on the ground working at it with the hammer, not sitting by the wagon waiting for someone to fix it, I thought, well, she could use a second pair of hands at the tire and I am going the same direction anyway." "But you kept riding after the wheel was fixed," she said. "I did," he said. "Why?" He looked at her directly. "Because I did not want to stop," he said, "and because I hoped that you did not want me to stop either." She held his gaze. The fire popped softly. Theodore moved in the darkness beyond the firelight, his hobble chains chiming quietly. "I did not want you to stop," she said. "I still do not." The thing that moved across his face then was tender and careful, and she recognized it for what it was because she felt something very similar moving through her own chest at the same moment. warm and slightly frightening in the way that anything true and important is always slightly frightening. "You should know," he said carefully, "that I am not a man of great means. I have some money saved enough to get by. I know cattle and horses and I can work land." "I have land," she said. "I know how to work it, but an extra pair of hands would not go amiss." "Margaret," he said, with a gravity that was not heavy but was entirely serious, "I am not making you a proposition. I am trying to tell you something." "I know," she said. "I am trying to listen to it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have been riding beside your wagon for 3 days," he said, "and in those 3 days I have thought about very little else besides." He started again. "I was not looking for anything when I left Colorado. I had put away the idea of I had not thought that I would." He stopped again, and she saw that he was a man who was precise with language and was frustrated by its current imprecision, and she found this endearing beyond all reasonable expectation. "Alfred," she said gently. "Yes," he said. "I understand what you are trying to say," she said. "I am saying something similar." He looked at her for a long moment in the firelight. "We have known each other 3 days," he said, "and 11 miles of river crossing and a wagon wheel and 3 shared meals and the best cup of coffee I have had in 2 years," she said. "I am not a girl of 18, and neither are you a young man of 20, and I think we are old enough to know what something feels like." "And what does it feel like?" he asked very quietly. She considered this seriously, because it deserved serious consideration. "Like finding your footing after a long stretch of bad road," she said. "Like something that was broken being quietly put right." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, that is exactly what it feels like." They did not say anything more that night, but when she climbed into the wagon she was smiling, and she was fairly certain he was too, though she could not see him from inside the canvas. Caldwell Creek sat in a wide valley between 2 low ridges. A young town in 1874, not much more than a main street with a general store, a land office, a small hotel, a saloon, a livery stable, a Methodist church that doubled as a schoolroom on weekdays, and perhaps 40 houses scattered around the valley. It had the particular quality of frontier towns that were growing. There was construction everywhere, the sound of hammers constant, lumber piled in lots, the smell of fresh-cut wood in the air alongside the dust, and the hoarse smell that was standard. Margaret drove her wagon into Caldwell Creek on the afternoon of what was now her 14th day of travel, with Alfred Watkins riding beside her exactly as he had been for the last 3 days, and she felt the eyes of the town on her in the way that a newcomer always feels assessed, categorized, filed away. The land office was run by a man named Prentice Holloway, who was heavyset and florid, and who confirmed the Monroe claim with a great deal of paperwork, and a few remarks about the challenge of working land alone that Margaret found condescending, and said so, calmly, and Holloway's eyebrows went up, and he glanced at Alfred, who stood beside Margaret with his hat in his hands and his expression entirely neutral. "I imagine you will manage fine, Mrs. Monroe," Holloway said hastily. "I expect I will," she said, and took her papers. The Monroe claim was 4 miles south of town, 160 acres under the Homestead Act, partly bottomland along a creek and partly rising ground that would need clearing. Robert had built a small house, 1 room, a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, and had started a barn before he had gone to work at the mine that killed him. The house was still standing, though the door had warped and there were birds nesting in the eaves, and the small garden plot Robert had scratched out had gone back to weeds, but the bones of it were sound, and the creek ran clear and cold, and the soil in the bottom ground was dark and rich. Margaret stood in front of the house and looked at it for a long time. Alfred stood beside her, a respectful half-step back, and said nothing. She had expected this moment to be harder than it was. She had expected to see Robert in every board and stone of this place. And she did. A little she could see his hands in the way the window frame was set, careful and straight, because Robert was a careful man, but she found that what she felt was not only grief. It was also something like possibility. Robert had begun something here. She was going to finish it. "It needs work," she said. "It does," Alfred agreed. "But it is solid." She turned to look at him. He was studying the house with a practical eye, assessing it the way a man assesses a thing he intends to help fix. "You do not have anywhere particular to be," she said. It was not quite a question. "I told you," he said. "I am not certain where I am going." "There is a small bunkhouse behind the barn," she said. "Barely more than a lean-to, but it has a roof. Robert built it for when the claim got big enough that he would need hired help." "I would not want to impose," Alfred said. "If you were the imposing sort, I would have said something about it 4 days ago," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I will stay and help you get the place in order," he said. "As long as you want me here." "That seems fair," she said. That first week was the most physical work Margaret had done since the winter she was 20, and her father's barn burned, and the whole family rebuilt it in October. She and Alfred worked from first light to last light every day, repairing the door and the window frames, recaulking the logs, cleaning the chimney, mending the fence line that had fallen in 2 places, cutting the weeds in the garden plot and turning the soil, patching the roof of the lean-to so it stopped the rain properly. She worked alongside him without self-consciousness, and he worked alongside her without condescension. And this, she thought sometimes in the evenings when she was so tired that thinking required actual effort, was perhaps the rarest and most valuable thing she had found on the whole long journey west. They ate supper together every night. He cooked some nights, she cooked others. He was a surprisingly decent cook for a man who had evidently been feeding himself alone for many years. He had patience, and patience is most of cooking. She was better at bread. He was better at stew. They established this early and organized themselves accordingly. On the 8th day, a neighbor came to call. Her name was Mrs. Esther Halvorsen, and she was a Norwegian woman of 50-some years who had homesteaded in the valley with her husband Ole 6 years before, and was the kind of woman who gathered information the way other people gathered berries steadily, and without appearing to work at it. She brought a jar of preserved peaches and sat at Margaret's table and drank coffee, and looked between Margaret and Alfred with bright, interested eyes. "You came out together?" she asked. "Mr. Watkins assisted me on the trail," Margaret said. "He is helping me get the claim in order." "I see," Esther said in a tone that clearly indicated she saw more than what she had been told and was not displeased by it. "Your husband is well?" Margaret asked, turning the conversation. "Ole is always well," Esther said comfortably. "He is the healthiest man in this valley, which is deeply unfair to the rest of the valley." She looked at Alfred. "You know cattle, Mr. Watkins?" "Some," Alfred said. "Ole is always needing an extra hand at the branding," she said. "He would pay fair wages." Alfred looked at Margaret. "If Mrs. Monroe can spare me," he said. "On the days I can spare you," Margaret said. "During the week we are getting the garden in." Esther's bright eyes went from one to the other, and she smiled into her coffee cup. On the walk back from seeing Esther to her horse, Alfred said quietly, "She thinks we are together." "She is not wrong to think it," Margaret said before she could decide whether to say it. Then she stopped walking and he stopped too, and they stood in the yard in the afternoon light with the smell of turned earth and fresh wood all around them, and she looked at him directly. "Are we?" "I am asking plainly because I am too old and too practical to be indirect about something this important." He looked at her for a long moment. His dark eyes were very serious. "I would like to be," he said. "If you are willing. I'm not going to pretend that I have not been thinking about little else since the second evening on the trail." "I have been thinking about it too," she said. "I am a careful man," he said. "I do not say things I do not mean, and I do not mean things partway. If I am courting you, I am courting you completely." The word courting, said so straightforwardly, made something warm move through her entirely. "Then court me," she said, "completely." He smiled then, the real smile, the slow, genuine one, and she was beginning to understand that this smile was a rare thing and therefore enormously valuable, and she intended to earn it as often as she could. He was, as he had promised, thorough. He was not a demonstrative man in the showy sense. He did not bring her flowers or make speeches, but he arrived every morning having thought about what she would need that day. He noticed when she was tired before she admitted it and directed them toward lighter tasks. He remembered, without being told twice, that she took her coffee without sugar and that she preferred the quiet of the early morning, and that she was not afraid of hard work, but that she needed the occasional hour of complete stillness to feel like herself again. On such evenings he would simply be somewhere else in the property, doing some task of his own, giving her the solitude without making her feel she had to ask for it. She, in turn, was learning him. He had nightmares some nights. She could hear him from the house, a muffled sound of distress from the lean-to, not loud, a man who had trained himself not to make noise even in his sleep, which she found heartbreaking. On those mornings he was quieter than usual and moved through the day with something careful around his eyes. And she did not ask him about the dreams, but she made sure the coffee was ready when he appeared, and she kept the morning easy. And by midday he was usually himself again. One evening near the end of June, she was sitting on the step of the house in the long evening light mending a tear in her working skirt, and he came and sat beside her on the step, not across the yard in his usual place, but beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him on her left side. "I want to tell you about the war," he said. She put down her mending and gave him her full attention. He talked for a long time. He was not a man who talked easily about deep things, and she could feel the effort it cost him, the way each sentence was carefully chosen. He had been at Petersburg. He had seen things that a person does not unsee. He had come home to Missouri in 1865 and found that the man he had been before was gone, and that the man who replaced him was quieter and more careful, and sometimes woke in the night with his heart hammering for no reason he could point to. He had married Clara in 1867. She had known about the war and had not been frightened by his quietness. And when she died in 1868, he had gone west, because the West was where men went when they needed somewhere that did not know their history. He had been in Colorado 3 years. He had worked cattle. He had saved his money. He had, he said, been reasonably content, which was not the same as happy but was not nothing. "And then I was in Independence on business," he said, "and I saw a woman arguing with a freight company man about the weight of her trunk." He said this plainly and without drama, but she understood what he meant, that she had changed the direction of something in him simply by existing and being herself, and that this was not something he had planned for or expected. "I am glad the wheel broke," she said. He looked at her. "I am glad I was there when it did," he said. He took her hand then, her right hand, which was lying in her lap beside the mending, and held it carefully in both of his. His hands were large and very warm and slightly rough from the work, and she turned her hand over and held his back. They sat like that on the step until the light was gone. By August, the garden was producing. By September, she had put up enough preserved vegetables for the winter. Alfred had worked several days for old Halvorsen, and had been paid in a combination of wages and the promise of a young heifer come spring. The Linta had been expanded into a proper small room with its own proper door and window. The barn had been repaired sufficiently to house Theodore for the winter, who received this news with his customary expression of deep suspicion. They were something to each other by August. They did not announce it exactly, though Esther Halvorsen and most of the valley had drawn their own conclusions and were apparently satisfied with them. What they were was warm and real, and conducted in the particular language of two people who had both been broken and put back together, and knew the difference between paper-thin wholeness and the genuine article. He kissed her for the first time in late August, on an evening when they had been walking the property boundary together after supper to check the fence line, which was a practical errand that had become, over time, a pleasant habit. They stopped at the high corner of the property where you could see south down the valley and east across the plain, and the sunset was doing its brilliant work in the west, and she turned to say something about the light and found him looking at her instead of the sky. "I am going to kiss you," he said, "if that is agreeable." "That is extremely agreeable," she said. He kissed her gently and carefully, with the same quality he brought to everything, thorough and unhurried and entirely present. When he drew back, she felt as though something that had been held very still inside her for a long time had been given permission to move. "I have been thinking about doing that since the river crossing," he said. "You could have done it considerably sooner," she said. "I wanted to be sure," he said. "Were you ever in doubt?" she asked. He considered this. "No," he admitted. "Not really." She laughed, and he laughed, and in the warm evening light at the high corner of her property, he put his arms around her and she rested her head against his chest, and they stood there looking out over the valley that was hers, that was becoming theirs. And the grass moved in the evening wind and the first star appeared, and it was the most at home she had felt anywhere in 2 years. September brought a land dispute that was not entirely unexpected. A man named Clyde Beaumont, who operated a cattle ranch north of the creek, had been using a strip of the Monroe property as a driving route for his cattle, had been using it, he claimed, for 2 years, since before anyone formally occupied the Monroe claim. He came to the house one afternoon with 2 of his ranch hands and his foreman, a taciturn man named Greer, and he stood in the yard and made the argument that use established a kind of right, which was not legally accurate but was delivered in the tone of a man who was accustomed to his arguments being accepted regardless of their accuracy. Margaret came out of the house to speak to him. Alfred came around from the barn and stood in the yard, not threateningly, not in a posture that was combative, but present in the way that a man is present when he intends to be noticed. "Mr. Beaumont," Margaret said, "I have my papers from the land office and the claim is clearly bounded. You are welcome to present your case to Prentice Holloway at the land office, who will no doubt be interested in your use of someone else's property without their knowledge or consent. In the meantime, I will thank you to use the county road, which is what it is there for." Beaumont was a big man with a red face, and he looked at Alfred in the particular way that men like Beaumont always looked at other men, trying to read the situation. "Who is this?" Beaumont said. "Alfred Watkins," Alfred said mildly. "He is associated with this property," Margaret said, which was carefully worded but entirely accurate. Beaumont looked between them again. He was making a calculation, and whatever the result was, he apparently concluded that it was not in his favor. "I will speak to Holloway," he said. "You do that," Margaret said. When they rode away, Greer looking back over his shoulder once, she let out a slow breath. "That was well handled," Alfred said. "He will go to Holloway and Holloway will tell him the same thing I did," she said. "The law is clear." "It is," Alfred said, "but men like that do not always pay close attention to the law. Men like that," she said, "tend to pay close attention to the response they get. I intend to give him nothing to work with." Alfred looked at her with that quality in his eyes that she had come to know, a particular kind of regard that was warm and direct and had something admiring in it. Beaumont went to Holloway, and Holloway told him what the law said, and the issue was resolved in Margaret's favor within 2 weeks. The cattle would go around. Beaumont was not gracious about it, but he complied, and the matter was closed. October came in cold and brilliant, the sky going that particular deep blue of the high plains autumn and the cottonwoods along the creek turning gold, and there was frost on the grass most mornings, and the air had that sharp mineral smell that meant winter was making its intentions known. Margaret and Alfred worked hard getting everything ready, more firewood split and stacked than she would need, the house rechinked, and the window frames wrapped, the cellar full of provisions. Theodore settled in his barn with enough hay to see him comfortable. On an evening when the first real cold had settled and they were sitting by the fire after supper, Alfred put down his coffee cup and looked at her with the particular expression that meant he had something he had been organizing in his mind. "I have a question to ask you," he said. She set her own cup down and gave him her full attention. "I have been on your property for 4 months," he said. "I have been, what we have been since August." I am 35 years old and I know my own mind. And my mind tells me that what I want is to stop being a man who is staying in a linta that you built for future hired help, and to be instead. He paused and began again. I want to marry you, Margaret, if you will have me. I want to stay here and work this land with you and be your husband in full, and I am asking you plainly because you have told me you prefer plain things. She looked at him for a long time. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pushing at the door. I will have you, she said. Yes. Absolutely and completely yes. He exhaled, and she realized he had been holding himself very still waiting for her answer, and this moved her enormously. I have been wanting to ask you since July, he said. July, she said. Alfred Watkins, we had known each other 7 weeks in July. I told you, he said. I know my own mind. She crossed to him, and he stood, and she put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him properly. And he held her with both arms around her, and they stood by the fire in the house Robert Monroe had built in a valley half a world from anywhere she had started. And she felt something settle in her like a key turning in a lock. Not the end of something, but the beginning of something, solid and full and real. They were married in December 1874 by the Methodist preacher in Caldwell Creek, in the little church that also served as a schoolroom, with Esther and Ole Havorson as witnesses, and a small gathering of valley people who had become, over the course of the autumn, something like neighbors and therefore something like community. Esther cried, which surprised no one. Ole shook Alfred's hand for a very long time and then shook it again. Margaret wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool and which she had pressed carefully the night before, and her hair was down for the occasion. And Alfred wore a clean shirt and his best trousers, and looked at her when she walked into the church with an expression that she intended to remember for the rest of her life. The preacher's name was Reverend Caleb Marsh, and he performed the ceremony with both sincerity and efficiency, which Margaret appreciated. And when he pronounced them married, Alfred kissed her in front of all those watching people with a gentleness and a thoroughness that made Esther produce her handkerchief again. They drove home to the Monroe claim. The Watkins claim now, officially, though she kept Monroe too, because a woman's history is hers to keep through 3 inches of new snow that had fallen while they were in town, and the valley was white and utterly still, and the sky was clear, and the stars were out in their winter extravagance. And Alfred took the reins because she was cold, and he tucked the lap robe around her, and she leaned against his side, and they drove home in the enormous quiet of a snow-covered world, and she was so happy it had weight. Winter on the high plains was its own education. The snows came hard, and sometimes the drifts were 6 feet against the barn door, and the temperature dropped to things she had not imagined, and there were days when they could not get out onto the property at all and were confined to the house together. She had worried before winter came that the confinement would be trying. She had been wrong. Alfred was the kind of person she could be in a small room with for a long time without running short of him. They played cards, and she taught him a word game her mother had taught her, and he beat her at it repeatedly with a calmness that was both infuriating and admirable. They read to each other from the small collection of books she had brought from Missouri. She had kept them and the $40, and the books had been worth considerably more than the money. They talked on those long winter evenings about everything, their childhoods, their beliefs, their losses, their hopes, the property, the spring, the future. She told him about Thomas, her brother killed at Chickamauga. She had not talked about Thomas to anyone in years. Alfred listened the way he always listened, completely, without rushing her, without offering comfort before she had finished saying the thing. He told her about his sister in Ohio, who was married to a schoolteacher and had 3 children, and how he had not written to her in over a year because he was not sure what to say about his life, which had been for a long time a thing he moved through without being fully present in it. "You should write to her," Margaret said. "I know it," he said. "What would you say?" He thought about it. "I would say that I am married and that she has a sister now, and that the situation is better than I expected any situation to be." "That is a good letter," Margaret said. He wrote to his sister Alina that week, and Alina wrote back in February, a long, warm letter that said, among other things, that she had been worried about him for years and that she was profoundly relieved, and that she intended to come west and meet Margaret as soon as circumstances permitted, which made Margaret feel unaccountably warm about a woman she had never met. By February, Margaret suspected she was expecting a child. She told Alfred on a Sunday morning when the light was coming through the east window and lying in long pale bars across the floor, and she sat across the table from him and said it directly, the way she said everything, and watched his face. What moved across his face was something she had not expected and could not have entirely predicted. It began with surprise and went rapidly through something that was very close to wonder, and then settled into something that was both joy and a kind of solemnity, as if he understood the weight of what he was feeling and was not going to treat it lightly. He reached across the table and took both her hands. "Are you certain?" he said. "Fairly certain," she said. "I will ask Mrs. Havorson. She has had 4 children and will know better than I do." "Margaret," he said. He stopped. "I know," she said. "I did not." He stopped again. "I had not let myself want this," he said finally. "After Clara, I had stopped wanting it. And now," she said, he looked at her across the table with the firelight on his face and the winter light at the window. "And now," he said, "I want it so much it is almost frightening." "It is frightening," she said, "but the good kind." "Yes," he said, "exactly that." Esther Havorson confirmed what Margaret had suspected, and made a number of practical recommendations in her comfortable, matter-of-fact manner, and invited herself to be on hand when the time came, which was what she had done for every woman in the valley who had needed it, and which Margaret was deeply grateful for. Spring came like a promise kept. First the mud, then the green, then the astonishing explosion of prairie wildflowers that Margaret had not been here to see the previous spring, and she walked the property in April and looked at what they had and felt the deep satisfaction of work that is real. The garden was going in again, larger this time. Alfred had arranged to purchase 2 cows in addition to the heifer Ole had given him, and there would be milk and butter and the possibility of a small herd over time. He had plans for expanding the barn. She had plans for an additional room on the house, which was going to need it. Theodore was old and had been old when she started out and was now older, but he had a warm stall and good hay, and had apparently decided that Caldwell Creek was a reasonable place to see out his remaining time. He and Alfred had reached a similar understanding to the one Theodore and Margaret had reached on the trail, a kind of mutual respect between 2 beings who recognized in each other a fundamental stubbornness that they had come to regard as a virtue. Ole Havorson helped Alfred with the barn expansion in May, and Alfred helped Ole mend fence on his upper pasture, and this was how the valley worked, a web of mutual assistance that made the individual homesteads possible in ways that they could not quite be alone. She thought sometimes about the land agent in Caldwell Creek who had made his disparaging remark about a widow managing a homestead alone, and she thought that he had been right in one narrow sense, not because she was a woman, but because no one in this country managed anything truly alone. The country was too large and the work too hard and the winters too long. You needed people. The trick was finding the right ones. In June, she wrote a long letter to her mother in Missouri. Her mother was 63 and widowed and lived with Margaret's older sister in Independence, and Margaret had not written as often as she should have during the hard months of grief and decision-making, and the letter she wrote now was a reckoning and an offering in equal measure. She wrote about the land and the house and the valley. She wrote about the winter and the spring. She wrote about Alfred carefully and at length, about how he had come to be riding beside her wagon and how he was there still in the permanent way now, and how he was the kind of man that her father, who had died when Margaret was 12, would have respected enormously. She asked her mother to come west if she was able. She said the country was large enough for anyone. Her mother wrote back in August. She was well, she said. She might come west the following spring if Margaret's sister could spare her. She was very glad, she said, about the husband. She had worried, she wrote, about Margaret going west alone, but had known better than to say so because Margaret had always known her own mind and always would. The baby was born in September of 1875, on a morning when the light was gold and the first turning cottonwoods were reflected in the creek. Esther Haverson was there, as promised, practical and calm and kind, and Alfred was in the house throughout, which was not always the custom but was what Margaret wanted and what Alfred, without question or hesitation, provided. The baby was a boy. He was red-faced and furious and absolutely healthy, and when Alfred held him for the first time, he went very still in the way that only the largest emotions can make a man very still. "Hello," Alfred said to the baby, very quietly, with such gravity and tenderness that Margaret had to close her eyes for a moment. They named him Thomas Robert Watkins, Thomas for her brother killed at Chickamauga, Robert for the man who had come west first and started what she was continuing. Alfred had suggested both names independently, and she had wept a little at the first suggestion and a little more at the second, and he had held her without saying anything because he understood that the weeping was not sorrow, but something more complicated and more necessary than sorrow. Thomas Robert Watkins was, from the beginning, a person with opinions. He had his father's dark eyes and something of his father's quality of stillness. He watched the world around him with serious attention from very early on, but he had his mother's tendency to decide something and pursue it without particular concern for what obstacles lay between him and the thing he had decided on. He was walking at 11 months and talking shortly after, and by the time he was 2, he had decided that Theodore the mule was his particular friend. And Theodore, who had not softened his opinion of humanity in any general sense, apparently made an exception in Thomas's case, and could be found on most afternoons with the small boy leaning against his front leg. The winter of 1875 to 1876 was hard, but they were better prepared for it, and it was less isolating than the previous one because they had each other, and the baby, and a rhythm to their days that the previous winter had lacked. Alfred carved a set of wooden animals for Thomas over the long cold months, a horse and a mule and a cow and a dog, and Thomas named them all Theodore regardless of species, which made Alfred laugh every time. Eleanor Watkins, Alfred's sister, came west in the summer of 1876 with her husband James and their 3 children, and she and Margaret took to each other immediately, in the way of women who recognize in each other a fundamental shared quality. In this case, a directness and a dry humor, and a patience with the vagaries of the men they loved. Eleanor was 3 years younger than Alfred, with the same dark eyes and a good deal more to say for herself, and she stayed 3 weeks and slept in the expanded room and helped in the garden and played with Thomas until he was devoted to her, and when she left Margaret felt the loss of her the way you feel the loss of family. "Your sister is wonderful," she told Alfred after Eleanor's wagon disappeared around the bend in the valley road. "She is," he said. He was holding Thomas, who was watching the road with his serious dark eyes as if he expected Eleanor to reappear. "She thinks you are the finest thing that ever happened to me." "She is right," Margaret said, and he laughed. "You are not lacking in confidence," he said. "I have learned it from you," she said. "You are one of the most quietly confident people I have ever met." He considered this. "I was not always," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what makes it valuable." The claim continued to grow in the way that good work grows steadily, season by season, without great drama but with consistent increase. By 1877, they had a proper herd of 9 cattle, a kitchen garden that produced enough to sell some surplus at the Caldwell Creek General Store, a second horse besides Alfred's bay, and an expanded house with 2 real rooms and a loft where Thomas slept. Margaret planted an apple tree on the south side of the house that first spring and told Alfred it was a long-term investment, and he had said seriously, that he approved of long-term investments. And now in 1877 the tree was 6 feet tall and had bloomed that spring for the first time, white flowers against the blue April sky, and she felt about that tree a particular pride that was connected to everything, to the permanence of the thing, to the fact that it would outlast them both, to the way that putting roots into the earth is both a practical and a philosophical act. The difficulties of the frontier were real and ongoing, and she did not pretend otherwise. There was a drought summer that scorched the garden and worried the creek, and a winter with ice storms that brought a cottonwood down across the fence line. There was the ongoing reality of the world they lived, in the displacement of native people from lands that had been theirs for generations, the slow closing of the open range as more settlers arrived, the particular injustices of a society that was still building its rules and had not yet made them fair. She and Alfred talked about these things in the way they talked about everything, directly, and without flinching away from the parts that were uncomfortable. He had seen in the war what it cost to pretend that wrong things were not wrong, and she had been a woman long enough to understand systems that were built to exclude, and the damage they did. They could not fix the world, but they did not pretend it was fixed, and they raised Thomas with the understanding that the size of the country was not an excuse for the smallness of certain men's thinking. By 1878, Thomas was 3, and had begun to follow Alfred around the property with the focused intensity of a boy who has decided that he intends to know everything his father knows. Alfred bore this with patience and amusement and spent hours teaching Thomas the names of things, the parts of a saddle, the different grasses along the creek, the tracks of a jackrabbit in the mud, the way to read the sky for weather. Margaret watched this and felt something in her that had no adequate word in English, something composed equally of love and gratitude, and the particular quiet joy of watching a good man be a good father. She had wondered sometimes in the first months of their marriage whether the speed of everything, the 3 days on the trail, the 4 months before the proposal, the relative quickness of it all had been too fast for something that was meant to last. Life had given her reason for caution about quick certainties, but she found, the longer they were together, that it had not been too fast at all. It had simply been efficient. They had both been old enough to know themselves, and knowing themselves they had recognized each other, and the recognizing had been quick because they were paying attention. He was not a perfect man. He was sometimes too contained, too prone to working through things alone that he might have worked through better with her help. He was stubborn in the particular way of men who have spent years proving to themselves that they can manage without anyone, and unlearning this took time. On 3 separate occasions in their first year of marriage she had to say plainly, "Tell me what is happening with you." And each time he had paused and organized himself and told her, and each time was easier than the last, and by the 3rd year she found he came to her without being asked, which was its own kind of milestone. She was not perfect either. She was fiercely independent to a degree that occasionally looked like stonewalling, and she had a particular way of going quiet when she was upset that was hard to read and harder to break through. She pushed herself too hard and did not acknowledge exhaustion until it knocked her flat, which drove Alfred quietly frantic because he saw it coming long before she did. They argued about this precisely once, at length, and she said her piece and he said his, and she conceded his point while maintaining that she had the right to judge her own limits, and he conceded that she did while reserving the right to say something when he thought she was misjudging them. And this compromise, reached with the directness that characterized everything they did, largely held for the remainder of their life together. In the spring of 1879, a letter came from Margaret's mother saying that she was coming west with Margaret's sister Clara, Margaret's sister, not the Clara Alfred had loved, though the coincidence of the name occasionally gave Alfred a quiet, private moment, and Margaret stood in the yard reading the letter twice to make sure she had understood it and then called to Alfred, who was at the barn, and read it to him out loud. He smiled. "You are pleased," he said. "I am very pleased," she said. Will you be all right, a house full of Monroe women? I have survived Thomas, he said, and Thomas has twice your stubbornness in a 3-year-old's frame. I believe I can manage. She threw a clod of dirt at him, which he dodged with the ease of a man who had been paying attention to her for 5 years. And she laughed and he grinned. And Theodore, who had wandered out of the barn into the yard, looked at both of them with an expression of elderly disdain. Her mother and sister arrived in June in a hired wagon from the stage stop at Caldwell Creek, and her mother stood in the yard and looked at the house and the garden and the apple tree and the valley spread out beyond the property. And then she looked at Margaret and then at Alfred standing beside Margaret with Thomas on his hip, and she said, "Well," in the tone that meant she was too full of feeling for regular words, and she opened her arms and Margaret walked into them. Her mother stayed the whole summer. Her sister stayed 6 weeks before returning to Independence and her own life there. The summer was the most domestic richness Margaret had known since childhood, the house full of voices, meals at the long table that Alfred had built over the winter, Thomas adored by his grandmother to a degree that Margaret privately thought might undo some of the good parenting she and Alfred had managed, evenings on the step watching the sunset with her mother beside her. Her mother said on one such evening, "He loves you very much." "I know it," Margaret said. "It is the kind of love that is not about how you make him feel," her mother said. "It is the kind that pays attention to how you are. Your father was that way." She paused. "Not all men are." "No," Margaret agreed. "Not all men are. You chose well," her mother said. "I did," Margaret said. "Though to be accurate, he rode beside my wagon for 3 days without telling me why, and I never asked him to stop, so perhaps we chose each other." Her mother smiled. "That is a good way to begin," she said. After her mother left in September, the valley was quieter in a way that had quality to it, that particular richness of a house that has been recently full of people and is coming back to its ordinary self. Thomas missed his grandmother, and said so regularly and thoroughly. Alfred made a new Theodore for him, a larger carved mule, more detailed than the first set, with a real mane of horsehair, and Thomas spent a week barely putting it down. The second baby announced itself in October of 1879, and this time Margaret told Alfred while they were walking the fence line in the evening, in the place they had always walked together, and when she said it, he stopped walking and looked at her with the same wonder she had seen on his face the first time, unchanged by familiarity, and she thought that this unreduced capacity for wonder in a man who had seen considerable darkness was perhaps the thing she loved most about him. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He took her hand and they walked on, and neither of them said much, but the silence was full of everything. The second child, born in the summer of 1880, was a girl. She came in July, also with Esther Havorson present, also healthy and furious about the state of the world she had arrived in, which suggested she would fit into the family well. They named her Eleanor Me Watkins, Eleanor for Alfred's sister, Me for Margaret's mother, whose given name was Margaret Me Monroe, and who received the news of her granddaughter's name in a letter that reportedly made her weep at the kitchen table in Independence. Thomas was 5 when his sister arrived, and after an initial period of assessment, he decided that she was acceptable, which from a Monroe Watkins was high praise, and he took to carrying her around with an authority that was both endearing and alarming given that he was 5 and she was very small. Alfred watched all of this with the quiet attention he brought to everything, and she could see in his face on certain evenings, when Thomas was showing Eleanor something, or when both children were asleep and the house was quiet, that he was a man who knew the value of what he had because he had spent years without it, and who did not take it lightly. Theodore the mule died in the fall of 1880, peacefully in his stall, of nothing worse than extreme old age. Thomas cried. Alfred buried him properly and marked the spot with a flat stone at the edge of the property. Margaret put her hand on the stone and thanked him. Theodore, the opinionated old mule who had walked her across Kansas and into her life, and meant it completely. They got a younger mule the following spring, and Thomas immediately named him Theodore, which was the only possible outcome. The years had a rhythm now, a good one. Spring planting and the calving and the lambing. They had added sheep, Alfred's idea, practical for the wool and summer work and the harvest and the putting up and the winterizing, and the long months of cold that were less hard than they had once been because the house was better, and their resources were more, and they were more themselves than they had been when this started. There were bad years and good years, and the land asked everything of them every single year, and they gave it, because the land had given them a life. In 1882, Alina wrote from Ohio that she was coming west again, this time permanently. James had decided on a teaching position in Caldwell Creek, which had a proper school now, and Alina was beside herself with excitement about it. Alfred received this news with a composure that only Margaret knew concealed a profound happiness, because she knew him better than anyone knew anyone after 8 years. The Marshes, James and Alina settled in Caldwell Creek, and the closeness was good for all of them. Alina and Margaret had the friendship that had been promised by that first summer meeting, conducted over regular meals and shared work, and the particular conversation of women who think clearly and are allowed to say so. Thomas started school in 1882 and was formidably capable at it, which surprised no one who had watched him follow his father around the property memorizing everything. And little Alina was the most determined small person the valley had seen since a certain widow had arrived in a wagon with a cracked wheel and refused to stop moving. On a May evening in 1883, nearly 9 years after a cracked wheel on a Kansas trail had changed the direction of 2 lives, Margaret and Alfred Watkins sat on the step of their house, the larger, solid house they had built on the bones of Robert Monroe's one-room original, and watched the sunset do its extravagant work over the valley. Thomas was in the barn. Alina was asleep inside, her small breathing audible through the open window. The apple tree on the south side of the house was in full bloom, white flowers trembling in the evening breeze, and it was tall enough now to throw real shade in the afternoon, which had been the plan all along. 9 years, Alfred said. Almost, she said. Next month. He looked at her in the way he still looked at her, directly and warmly, without anything held back. I want to say something, he said. Say it, she said. When I was riding beside your wagon, he said, in those 3 days before I told you anything, I was working out how to be a person again. I had been not a person exactly for a long time, going through the motions of it. And riding beside you, watching you drive that wagon through whatever came at it, watching the way you looked at the country like it was something you intended to understand rather than something that was happening to you, he paused. I thought, that is how a person lives. That is the thing I forgot. She looked at him. You did not fix me, he said carefully. That is not what I am saying, but you showed me what it looked like to be alive in the whole sense of the word, and that was enough to start with. She reached out and took his hand. You showed me the same thing, she said. I was going west because it was the right thing to do, and because I am not the sort of person who stops when things are hard, but I was very alone with it, not just in body. In the whole sense. And you rode beside me, and you held the iron tire straight, and you made coffee, and you watched the sunset, and you were just present. Wholly present without requiring anything from me. Do you know how rare that is? I know it better now than I did then, he said. We were good for each other, she said. We are good for each other, he corrected gently. Yes, she said, present tense. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and the evening light came down over the valley in long gold bars, and the apple tree bloomed, and inside the house Alina stirred in her sleep and settled again, and from the barn came the sound of Thomas talking to the second Theodore in the same tone his mother had once used to negotiate with the first one. They sat there until the stars came out, all the way to the edge of dark, and then they went inside together. The land around them was old and enormous and largely indifferent to human plans, the way all truly large things are. It had been there before them and would be there after. but the apple tree would be there too, throwing its shade over the south side of the house, and the name Watkins would be in the valley records, and the children would know that their father had been a man who rode beside a widow's wagon for 3 days without saying why, and that their mother had never asked him to stop, and that this unspoken, unhurried, deeply attentive act of presence had been the beginning of everything. Margaret Monroe had gone west for land, and she had gotten that and more. She had gotten an ally and a partner and a husband and a friend, and she had given in return the same things, completely, in the way she did everything without reservation, without half measures, without pretending to want anything other than the whole truth of a life lived fully and beside someone who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. Alfred Watkins had gone west to find somewhere that did not know his history, and he had found something better, a place that was becoming his history, built board by board and season by season with someone who did not require him to be undamaged, but who accepted him in full, damage and all, and called it enough because it was. Thomas Robert Watkins grew up tall and dark-eyed and formidably capable, and went to school and then to college, a thing his parents had saved for and insisted on, and came back to the valley with a law degree and a wife named Hannah who was from Missouri originally, and had his mother's gray eyes and his father's quality of stillness, which Thomas felt was exactly what he had been looking for, though he could not have told you how he knew. Eleanor Mee Watkins grew up with her mother's auburn hair and her Aunt Eleanor's gift for language, and she taught school in Caldwell Creek for 30 years and was the finest teacher the valley ever produced. And when she married a man named David who made her laugh every single day, which she said was her only criterion, and which her father said was the right criterion. The second Theodore lived to a fine age and was succeeded by a third, and the Watkins herd grew to 30 head, and the property was solid and productive, and was a place where people were welcome and fed and treated as the equals they were. And the apple tree grew large enough that its shade fell across the step where Margaret and Alfred had sat 9 years, and then 19 years, and then beyond, watching the sunsets and drinking coffee and talking about everything or nothing as the mood took them, with the steady ease of people who have found in another person a landscape they intend to live in for the rest of their lives. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole world, made of 3 days on a Kansas trail and a cracked wheel and a cup of coffee and a man who rode beside her wagon without being asked, and a woman who let him stay without requiring an explanation. It was everything.